perhaps nobody's surprise, my favorite of the American Shizek-developed Silent Hill games far and away is Shattered Memories, a loose remake of the original game designed from the ground up to take advantage of the Wii's motion capabilities for gameplay, and also other worse ports. The plot follows Harry Mason after a car crash, searching for his lost daughter in the town of Silent Hill, while strange otherworldly events transpire. Or do they? Shattered Memories was the second Silent Hill game developed by Climax Studios after Silent Hill Origins, and had quite a few interesting iterations before it was greenlit that had the same base psychological profiling mechanics. Now, while I don't particularly like using auteur theory when discussing most media, since it can be a bit too limiting when contending with large-scale productions like television shows, movies, video games, and so on, I do think it's worth noting Sam Barlow's influence on Shattered Memories, since it was kind of the start of his focus on meta-narrative frameworks that he likes to use in games that he works on. He was the lead writer and designer on the project, so a lot of creative decisions were developed by him, and I do read his voice in the final product, which we'll discuss later. Due to the nature of Shattered Memories' story, I'll be breaking my normal structure and front-loading the baseline mechanical discussion before diving right into the game's ending and its implications. Since the ramifications of that are so large, a standard play-by-play wouldn't really work. More than usual for this series, there will be unmarked spoilers once I get into that, so you've been warned. As I was alluding to, the main draw of the game beyond it being a very loose remake of Silent Hill 1 is its psychological profiling mechanic, something you're alerted to as soon as you start the game and in most of the marketing material. This type of system is an expansion on something that the previous Silent Hill games were doing, in particular Silent Hill 2 of how deliberately obscured the 3 new game endings are to get, and how individual actions in the game contributes towards that. The difference here is that the macro and micro decisions you're making have tangible ripples throughout the game while still maintaining the same rough story structure. Characters will change in appearance and personality, locations will be lit and built differently, and can extend further to the text messages you receive. This has some similarities with the Telltale choice system, with major choices being telegraphed via the therapy sessions, and more minor choices often being understated, not having obvious effects until later. That said, the way Shattered Memories handles it is a lot deeper, due in part to the game's short length, which allows for the potential of more variations, which is pretty interesting to see. Moment-to-moment gameplay when not in the other world has the notable absence of any combat mechanics, leading to a larger focus on exploration and puzzle solving. I know some folks are mixed on fiddling with puzzles, but I quite like them since they have a material element you can interact with. The Silent Hill-inspired Signalis has similar puzzles like this, and I'm sure that's the only reason why lesbians like it so much. A key element contributing to exploration is Harry's phone, which works as a combination of the game's HUD, main menu, and a large source of the game's storytelling.
Why can't you be relaxed with me, like you should? Is it your parents' house? You don't want to do it there? Maybe there's other places. Why you gotta be so frigid?
Throughout this all, you are continually in control of where Harry is looking, which is important to the psychological profiling since the game is intended to shape itself based on your habits. You know, looking at lewd imagery for long enough makes Harry a weirdo, that sort of thing.
Now, the testing that is done by Dr. K accounts for about 25% of the data we have on the player. The rest of the data, the 75% outside of these psych sessions, is taken from watching the player as he plays the game, observing which items the player is interested in, how long he spends looking at them, routes he takes. Does he go straight through this door here, or does he investigate and look around, look for alternative routes? When the player interacts with puzzles, does he do so in an analytical way? Does he just rush in and try and solve things by brute force? Does he sit back and take his time? Is he interested in story-based items, in items to do with facts? Is he interested in sexual imagery in the environment? Does he consult his map often? Does he use the annotation feature on his map? So we're constantly tracking everything the player does, noticing the small details. The game is constantly spooling data and using this to analyse the player's psychology.
I've seen some perfectly valid critiques that having the system be so overt limits exploration since you get ostensibly punished for examining interesting things in the environment. And that's fair. Once you have an understanding of the system and are trying to go for a specific ending, it can ruin the illusion a bit and make your actions feel more robotic and artificial, which I would argue is intentional and kind of interesting, but does go against the importance of immersion when it comes to horror games. Existing within a horror game is predicated quite a lot on atmosphere and mood, with some of the most often criticized mechanics in them being the ones that are too gamey and artificial, such as jump scares or QTEs, which can have their place in moderation, but in abundance makes things feel way more annoying. If I did have to point to a serious problem I have with Shattered Memories, it's that it's overall not that great at atmosphere and doesn't really present the illusion of danger, best exemplified by the game's various chase sequences. Basically, at certain points in the story, the game will automatically shift into the other world, most of the time during gameplay, which is pretty cool to see, and you need to run away from monsters called Rorschachs, who, from a design perspective, I think are really cool, and how they change based on your decisions is neat, but are kind of ruined in the context they exist in. The chase sequences are unambiguously the weakest part of Shattered Memories. While they have a good reason in the story to exist, and the last one in particular is effective, they're let down by a lot of janky, frustrating game elements and confusion. Most environments the chases take place in are large mazes with a lot of rooms that look very similar, which combined with the frantic pace you need to run at, generally leads to frustration and annoyance from getting lost and worn down by the button mashing you have to do. Shattered Memories is already a pretty short game, and these chases take up a disproportionate part for how little most of them progress the story and themes. Now, the reason these chases exist the way they do at all is in part a compromise from the developers, which we'll talk about later, and are sort of here to fill in gaps necessary to sell the game to a horror audience. This sort of problem is not unique here, since the back and forth on the importance of engaging with monsters forms a lot of the discussions around a lot of horror games. For Silent Hill in particular, the contrast between the almost lethargic combat in 2 versus the more aggressive style in 3 was partly due to publisher insistence that combat be more and more of a focus, but their differences also serve to inform the meaning of their respective texts. If we read this from a ludonarrative perspective, 2 doesn't have very complicated combat because James isn't really someone looking to do that, and 3 has more advanced combat because of Heather's need to defend herself primarily alone and her eventual quest for revenge. The same also applies to Shattered Memories. By having the only mode of engagement with the Rorschachs be fear and running away, it informs the narrative because of how the main character is avoiding some larger truth that therapy is slowly uncovering, a flight mechanism being triggered by touching a mental hot stove. So let's now dive into the main character of the story, the character whose perspective affects everything. Let's talk about
This is going nowhere. I'm spelling it out, but you're not listening. Your troubled school days? How you're conflicted about marriage? Your denial of death? The unfounded guilt? Abnormal sexuality? 18 years of denial. A whole universe of fantasy in that thick skull of yours. A skull teeming with agents of repression. Blind children clutching photos in the dark. Pale freaks goggle-eyed from watching home movies on loop. The term is complicated grief. But it's simple, isn't it? A young girl. Her parents don't get along. She blames herself, as all children do. Then Daddy dies. What's a girl to do? Deny that Daddy died. Deny who Daddy was. What 7-year-old actually knows who their parents are anyway? So she obsesses and obsesses over this fantasy dad propping up her make-believe with scraps of a happy life that never was, scraps of a father who never existed. Wake up! Your dad wasn't a hero. Wasn't your knight in shining armor. He was a human being. You never knew him. And you never will. The dad walking around in your head isn't even a ghost. He never existed. A Frankenstein's monster, a child's fantasy. But you're alive. Your mother is alive. She's not the monster you make her out to be. You need to live your life. Cheryl.
The major twist of the game is that Harry Mason was already dead, with a cheeky callback to the bad ending in Silent Hill 1, with him instead existing as this complex coping mechanism Cheryl's developed due to trauma she experienced both from his death and inflicted on her by various people in the town. The reason the psychological profiling is so central to the game is because of how the game is trying to explain the complicated process of living with grief and the ways in which it affects memory. Harry died when Cheryl was a kid, implied to be shortly after him and Dahlia divorced, and in Cheryl's eyes, that was the start of a downward spiral that defined her life up until fairly recently, where she felt like she had no control over any of her circumstances, and the world was exploiting that specifically to harm her. To say this concept hits home for me is a bit of an understatement. As I talked about with Silent Hill 3, my father died fairly recently, and I've had to contend with very complicated emotions due to trauma and memories. While I won't get into specifics, it's only been within the last few years that I've been able to be more open about his abuse, which was never physical, but was very much emotional and financial. There have been days where I only see him as a monster, and there have been days where I see him as a person broken by abuse and addiction. It's why I feel the ending of Shattered Memories is pretty important, because no matter which actions you take, Dr. K will insist to not see Harry as a hero, but instead as a human being with all the complications that arise from that. So now let's contend with the many complexities that arise, the most obvious being the implications of the narrative itself being false, but constructed from Cheryl's perceptions and memories. I've talked before with Silent Hill 2 the concept of a dissociative fugue or fugue state, where an event or situation is so traumatic that you develop amnesia over it as a coping mechanism. With 2, that was in the context of discussing guilt from murder, and for Shattered Memories, it's in the context of coping with trauma from being abused. The Harry you play as is an aspect of Cheryl, both as an amalgamation of memories and through implication, another self Cheryl constructed to examine her memories, allowing her to see things she struggles with from a more emotionally detached perspective, such as being drugged at a party, having photos of her taken while she's naked, and being groomed by a teacher, most events of which she is implicitly or explicitly blamed for over the people who actually caused her harm. There are parallels that can be made between Maria and Harry in this circumstance, since while Harry is definitely not real and Maria it's more ambiguous, they're both in part mental projections formed by people trying to cope with a reality they keep denying. Part of why Cheryl keeps trying to assign blame either to herself or her parents is because she is coping with a reality where the dehumanization of women, along with victims of trauma and abuse, is heavily normalized. It is extremely alienating, and that's something that takes a long time to recover from. Memory itself is very fickle, with details often shifting in and out depending on when and how a memory is revisited. If you're feeling extremely low, for instance, happier memories can take on a darker quality. So the ways in which the game shifts based on player choice metatextually is to account for player agency, but textually is how Cheryl is shifting this constructed story she made around her perceptions of her father, which in turn affects her memories. This, by effect, makes Cheryl a lot closer to the player than is usual for a video game protagonist, since how she is seeing events is directly proportionate to how you're seeing things, which can tell us a lot not just about how she's seeing her father, but also her neighbors in Silent Hill and what she's internalizing. Extremely noticeable for Mother Dahlia, who it is implied she demonizes and blames for her father's death. Outside of Cheryl herself, the most interesting character perhaps is Michelle Valdez, who is the only person in the main cast that isn't based on a character from Silent Hill 1, somewhat ironically fulfilling the role of Lisa more than Lisa does. Michelle's a strange character. She seems to know more than she's letting on and says she knew Cheryl in school, which we know isn't true, but the familiar tone is quite interesting. Personally, I interpret Michelle to be a sort of wish fulfillment version of Dahlia for Cheryl, someone she is able to project a lot of her experiences onto. Note the scene where her and her boyfriend John are arguing while you're in the backseat of the car. It's very likely there was a time when Cheryl was a kid where her parents argued like this, and she lacked any real agency over it, and they're being used in order to approach and contextualize how this felt. Wow, she's just like me for real. The most clear evidence of this is the scene where Michelle disappears for a time and is replaced by Dahlia. Note what specifically causes this to happen.
I should have offered you a drink.
No, it's fine. I'm confused enough as it is. I just want to get going, put today behind me.
Hey, everything's gonna be fine, you know? We'll be there soon, and then you can see your wife and daughter and...
Wife?
You're married, aren't you? You're wearing a ring. You okay?
No, I'm a bit lightheaded. Gotta go clear my head.
The mention of Dahlia caused a break in the constructed story's events, which allowed for Cheryl's perception of her mother to slip in and start influencing things, only to get interrupted before things progressed too far. This back and forth shifting between Dahlia and Michelle shows that Cheryl, despite her denial, does want to try and understand her mom and the nature of her relationship to Harry. She isn't fully seeing Dahlia as a monster, which is something she heavily struggles with. These forms of reality breaks are fairly common through the story whenever things progress too far, generally leading to a Rorschach chase, which is a direct manifestation for therapy work contrasting for fantasy, which only stops once past and present combine at the lighthouse, which is implied to be Cheryl allowing herself to heal from therapy and confront her manifestation directly. It's pretty neat stuff. Everything feels purposeful, and even if I dislike individual elements, I think it leads to a very effective conclusion. That said, it is worth noting that quite a lot of the game's usage of its psychological profiling is based on pseudoscience, more specifically Freudian psychology, which has been routinely debunked by psychoanalysts for like a century now, but the ideas embedded within it still proliferate in pop culture, and the horror genre especially. And I do understand why, since for storytelling, being able to have things represent themes and ideas not being stated directly by the characters is pretty golden, at the cost of potentially validating theories whose core issues they can't be empirically verified, and are more vibes-based, especially a problem when they reflected a lot of Freud's own Eurocentric and sexist perspective. Seriously, read up on that. He called women a dark continent. As just a horror experience, I don't think Shattered Memories' handling of this is harmful, since it's being used directly to help you relate to a woman rather than trying to pathologize Cheryl as inherently crazy or something. But it's just worth noting since it's important to critically examine why certain elements exist the way they do and for what purpose. In any case, the ultimate use of the psychological profiling informs the game's various endings in interesting ways. Basically, the ending is broken into two different parts, the first being the confrontation with the manifestation of Harry, and the second is the end of the videotape Cheryl kept avoiding. The confrontations have three variants, two of which have Cheryl accept Harry's death, which turns him to ice, and one where she keeps seeing him as a hero and he continues living in her memories. Notably, you only get an ending where Cheryl doesn't move on if you continually refuse to engage with the therapy sessions, either by giving contradictory or fake answers, or showing disinterest where you can. I take this to be the game responding to you not engaging with it honestly, and giving an honestly pretty grim result. The ending of the videotape has four variations, all which imply that Harry was not the hero Cheryl wants him to be. He couldn't hold a job, is heavily implied to be an alcoholic, and cheated on Dahlia with multiple other women leading to their divorce. Although notably, Dahlia is shown to be physically abusive towards him, which in context comes from how out of control the situation is, which explains why Cheryl saw her as a monster for so long. Oh, also, there's a UFO ending, which is great.
After all we've said, all we've discussed, you honestly believe that your father was abducted by aliens? It made more sense when you were talking about cults and demons.
This whole town, it's really a giant spaceship.
James?
Wrong day again?
See you tomorrow, James. One of my couples therapy patients. Haven't seen his wife in a while. Where were we?
My mother was a bitch.
Go on. I'm listening.
Now, beginning another round of if all endings are equally canon or not, like usual, the answer is yes, but the implications are a bit different. Personally, while I believe the ultimate point of the game is to help the player relate to Cheryl in a personal, direct way by tearing down specific boundaries between you and who you're controlling, I believe ultimately all these endings are to help paint a broader picture of Harry as a person, reconstructing Cheryl's memories of him into something more complete and real, and are therefore all equally canon and connected due to how they don't directly contradict each other. It's impossible to have a complete understanding of someone from singular events. Those events exist in context, and that context can be revealed through talking with other people that were there, or applying lenses to events via therapy or frameworks. The game doesn't tell you exactly what to think on this, but for me, I think it helps show a very realistic portrayal of recovery and how complicated it can be. Cheryl is up there with Heather for me in terms of the characters in this series I like the most, and hey, they're even kind of sort of the same person. How about that? With all that laid out, like usual, I want to get a bit into common discussions around the game along with why it turned out the way it did. So first, one take I tend to see is that it's not really Silent Hill, generally stemming from complaints of a lack of combat in the motion puzzles, but more critically the removal of the cult and by extension the actual mechanical function of the town. Since Shattered Memories is purely psychological and not supernatural, the monsters and locations informed by someone's perspective doesn't exist, which by effect heavily contradicts canon and puts the game into an alternate universe, which is only tangentially related to the rest due to shared concepts, themes, and characters. The combat and motion puzzles more fall into nitpicks, which I've already talked about, but as to the changes to the series' canon, well, that's more complicated. I don't necessarily want to say canon doesn't matter, since building upon canon can be fun and interesting, and without it we wouldn't have gotten the games that we did. However, I do think it's way too limiting to only value strict adherence to a perception of canon over other aspects. When examining the Team Silent games, what's noticeable is that they all handle the topic of the town and the cult extremely differently. In 2, you never meet any townspeople or cult members with the exception of Ernest, and the town's gods are only referenced rather than directly shown. It's still developing the setting's lore, what with Toluca Prison and how potentially the town itself is the cause of everything, but it's handling many topics in a completely different way from 1. With 3 and 4 of The Room, a large amount of their narratives don't take place in the actual town. 3 spends roughly half of its narrative in the place Heather lives being affected by the otherworld, and in 4, you only visit locations in the margins of the town itself. The town is still an important element being referenced, and these games are more culty than 2, but the elements they're focusing on are developing completely different themes and ideas. Silent Hill 3 is a coming-of-age revenge tale about a girl contending with a past full of extreme objectification, and choosing to either be a tool for that or to move on. And 4 talks about isolation and the want to connect to others despite the ways in which social conditions limit that. If every single game is just about someone going to Silent Hill and experiencing the same kind of personal hell as 2, then it quickly get a little repetitive and would limit what types of stories could be told, which is why Team Silent shifted their focus in the first place. The proposed Silent Hill 5 was even going to show the town as it would have been normally without the fog, which would have been really interesting. So with that context, Shattered Memories relegating the monsters in Otherworld as purely metaphor is another attempt to explore new territory, which metatextually to me has me read it about the same regardless. None of these games are real, the things we're seeing on screen are abstractions of real-world concepts, so having a game in which the central twist is that the events you're seeing didn't literally happen as you experienced them is pointing to that. Critically, I don't really think Shattered Memories as a story would have benefited from the Order being present, since this is not a game about Alessa or overt forms of indoctrination, or at least not as explicitly. As for the game being in an alternate canon from the other games, that's also not particularly a negative to me, since I find it interesting how known characters were reinterpreted based on perception. To round out this essay, I want to now discuss parts of the game's development process, starting with the rejected pitches for the game, Brams, PD, and Cold Heart. The former was intended to be a first-person shooter, and the latter is very much in line with the other mainline games, along with having survival mechanics like Temperature, with both featuring prominently the psychological profiling system. Cold Heart in particular focuses on a troubled woman named Jessica struggling with trauma that is implied to stem from the death of someone close to her. Sounds familiar, right? Yeah, so while the survival mechanics didn't make it in, the ultimate concept of a woman going through therapy, contextualized with gameplay sections in Silent Hill, ended up showing up here. While I like the overall implementation and I think it makes for a pretty good story, I am saddened that this pitch never got off the ground. The concept was apparently too out there for corporate execs and would have had to go through red tape, which led to Climax needing to take the out of remaking the first game due to that being greenlit before Origins, a move I suspect was motivated both by the success of the first film and, potentially, the success of the Resident Evil 1 remake and Resident Evil 0 after being released back to back. A lot of compromises needed to be made to get Shattered Memories finished, the most obvious of which is the chase sequences that exist to replace the gaps left from a lack of a combat system, which only came about from the original producer happening to leave in the middle of the project. The intention behind that was to have the game appeal to a non-core audience of potential gamers who may not be familiar or even bored with combat systems, which conflicted with Konami's marketing department selling the game as a core title. This speaks to an industry that even back in 2009 prioritized the preservation of the ideas of the old rather than letting new and exciting ideas flourish, which has only gotten progressively worse in recent years. Even though I like quite a lot of remakes that have been made, I would much rather resources be put into new ideas. But art is often not defined by the artists, it's defined by the people who more often than not don't care. I don't fault the developers at Climax for having two different projects end up not turning out perfectly. Honestly, it's a miracle both this and Origins are playable at all considering the deadlines they were working under. And where would we be without gay icon Travis Grady? In fact, I would say that while Shattered Memories stands on its own as its own narrative, a lot of its meaning is very much enhanced if you keep Silent Hill 1 and 3 in mind when looking at its story, which Sam Barlow talks about in an interview that he did.
Your memories of the original game of Silent Hill 1 are being twisted and turned into something, and we're revealing like the layer of reality. It was also my attempt. I was not the biggest fan of Silent Hill 3. I didn't like the fact they revisited the Harry storyline and some of the choices. To some extent, this was my attempt to, in my eyes, so apologies to people that love Silent Hill 3, but to redeem some of the story of Silent Hill 3 and also redeem the bad ending. So the bad ending of Silent Hill 1, like I personally hate these kind of alternate endings that don't really coexist in these old games, right? So 99% of people that played Silent Hill 1 will play it one time and they'll get the bad ending. A very small minority of players will go back and replay the game to get the good ending. And I didn't like that as a player. For the majority of people that played that game, they would get this ending, which kind of shat on what they'd achieved. And so I was trying to redeem that.
So while I think Barlow's wrong about Silent Hill 3 since that one's peak, I do think his approach with handling elements he had issues with is solid. He wanted to create an experience that is meaningful and complete on a first playthrough, rather than leaving things open. And for me, that intention succeeded considering how overly verbose I've been. In summary, Shattered Memories is neat. It's not perfect, and certainly has more flaws than even Silent Hill 4, but I like it regardless, and I relate to it very highly, so I'm willing to embrace those flaws and contextualize them, rather than acting like the game doesn't have valuable aspects to it. As always, thank you for Spazbo4 for additional footage of the endings, and to my patron for their support. If you would like to support me financially, I have a link to my Patreon in the description. You can also do like, comment, and subscribing if you wish. Until next time.
You are lying. I never hit you. You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
Why are you so hysterical?